You have been told a lie about how power is seized and held. You were taught that the true architects of history are defined by the weight of steel, the roar of gunpowder, and the brutal machinery of industrial warfare. But in some cases, the most devastating threat to a nation's stability doesn't come from a foreign army at your gates. It comes from something small, unpredictable, and entirely organic. In 1932, the gears of high-stakes diplomacy ground to a halt, not because of a diplomatic insult or a troop movement, but because of a single bird. This wasn't just a fluke of nature. It was a catalyst for a political crisis, so volatile and severe that it pushed the government to the very brink of collapse. Imagine the tension in the room as officials scrambled to contain a fallout triggered by a creature with feathers rather than firearms. How does one small life hold the power to destabilize an entire administration? This isn't just a historical oddity. It is a study in how a single, unexpected variable can shatter the carefully constructed facade of political stability. You have to understand that when the stakes are this high, any crack in the foundation, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, can turn into a chasm that swallows an entire regime. Stay with me, because we are uncovering exactly how this one bird nearly dismantled everything. Your entire existence, your rights, your land, and the very laws that govern your life could be dismantled in an instant by something you would never expect to see on a battlefield. Imagine looking out your window and realizing that your nation's sovereignty isn't being dismantled by a neighboring army or a rogue dictator, but is instead hanging by a single, fragile thread, held by a feathered creature with a beak. It sounds like a fever dream, doesn't it? But in the high-stakes theater of international law and geopolitical tension, the smallest details often carry the heaviest weight. When a biological anomaly or a migratory path crosses into forbidden territory, it triggers a cascade of legal crises that can paralyze a government overnight. You aren't just looking at a bird, you are looking at a living catalyst for a diplomatic meltdown. One misplaced wingbeat can ignite a firestorm of territorial disputes, forcing leaders to choose between national pride and international cooperation. Every feather becomes a point of contention, every chirp becomes a demand for recognition. You have to ask yourself, how much power does a small creature actually hold over the fate of millions? The truth is that in our interconnected world, nothing is too small to be dangerous. One bird can force a superpower to its knees, proving that even the smallest life can hold the keys to your freedom. You might think you're safe behind your front door, but in certain cities, the very air you breathe is contested territory by an enemy that refuses to retreat. This wasn't a fable or a children's story, it was the Great Pigeon War. In a move that sounds like something out of a dystopian thriller, the Japanese government officially declared a state of emergency against avian intruders. Imagine walking through a bustling metropolitan district where every fluttering wing and cooing note is viewed not as a nuisance, but as an act of biological invasion. The authorities didn't just see birds, they saw a systematic threat to public health and urban infrastructure that required a radical, uncompromising response. By declaring this state of emergency, the government signaled that the status quo was no longer an option. They were forced to mobilize, turning city blocks into tactical zones where the presence of pigeons became a legal transgression. Every bird became a target in a high-stakes battle for the sovereignty of the streets. You can almost feel the tension shift as the policy moved from nuisance management to full-scale conflict. This was about control, safety, and the desperate measures a civilization takes when nature pushes back too hard. The war wasn't just fought with nets or traps, it was waged through law, decree, and a nationwide crusade to reclaim the sky. You would never suspect that something so small could be viewed as a catastrophic threat to your very survival. Yet in the heart of one of the world's most densely populated cities, this is exactly how residents perceived them. You might think it sounds absurd, a simple bird being categorized as a hazard, but for the people living in Tokyo, these creatures were not just pests. They were recognized as a direct biological threat to public safety and critical infrastructure. Imagine walking through a neon-lit district where every overhead wire and structural beam is part of a high-stakes urban machine. To the locals, these birds weren't just flying, they were agents of decay. They nested in the delicate wiring that powered entire city blocks, their waste corroding metal and creating fire hazards that could plunge neighborhoods into darkness. Every nest tucked away in a steel girder was a ticking clock toward a structural failure. This wasn't a matter of aesthetic preference or nuisance hunting. It was a calculated defense against an invasive biological force threatening the integrity of the city's bones. They weren't just birds anymore. They were invaders destabilizing the systems you rely on every single day to keep your world running. In Tokyo, the war wasn't fought for beauty. It was fought to protect the infrastructure from a silent, feathered siege. Imagine a world where your very survival depends on what lies above your head, and the very air you breathe becomes a hunting ground for predators that don't feel pity or fear. For those living under the shadow of Imperial Japan, the threat wasn't just atmospheric, it was an orchestrated invasion of their safety. The government didn't simply deal with these threats in a passive sense, nor did they offer mere warnings to the local populations. They took a calculated, aggressive stance that signaled something far more extreme. They authorized the systematic use of heavy explosives and recruited professional hunters to actively clear the skies. This wasn't a relocation program, it was an eradication campaign. By deploying specialized hunters, men trained to track and eliminate targets with lethal precision, and using high-yield explosives to blast through the overhead danger, the state signaled that any presence in the sky was a target. Every explosion was a deliberate move to reclaim territory from a threat they deemed intolerable. This wasn't just policy, it was a scorched earth tactic to ensure total dominance over the environment. They didn't want to coexist with the danger, they wanted to erase it entirely, turning the sky into a cleared zone where only their authority remained. Every blast and every hunt served as a grim reminder that in this era, anything occupying your space would be purged by force. You think you know what defines the landscape of your city, but you're only seeing the surface level, and that is exactly what they want you to believe. While your eyes were fixed on the pigeons fluttering in the public squares, a much darker conflict was being systematically erased from your history books, the War of the Ants. It isn't just a forgotten footnote, it is a hidden struggle for survival and territory that has been scrubbed from the narrative. Imagine a world where the ground beneath your feet wasn't peaceful, but a literal battlefield of chemical warfare and territorial conquest. While historians focused on the grand movements of men, they ignored the microscopic empires fighting for dominance in the shadows. This isn't just about insects, it's about a biological siege that occurred right under our noses while we were distracted by the obvious. By removing this from your education, the truth of this ancient struggle was buried, leaving you blind to the constant, invisible warfare occurring in every crack of the pavement. Every time you step outside, you are walking over a graveyard of a conflict so intense it redefined the boundaries of survival. The War of the Ants wasn't just a skirmish, it was a total conquest of territory that history chose to forget, but the evidence is still there, waiting for someone to notice. Imagine waking up one morning to find that everything you own, the land beneath your feet, the food on your table, and the very survival of your lineage, has been erased by an enemy you cannot see, touch, or fight with steel. In the 19th century, this wasn't a nightmare of fiction. It was a devastating reality for millions. Entire agricultural economies were not dismantled by the thundering hooves of invading armies or the smoke of heavy artillery, but by microscopic invaders that moved in total silence across the fields. These invisible predators didn't just steal a harvest, they hollowed out entire civilizations from the inside out. When a blight struck, it didn't just take one crop, it paralyzed the economic engine of entire nations, turning golden fields into grey graveyards overnight. Farmers watched helplessly as their life's work withered in weeks. Victims of a biological siege that moved faster than any horse could gallop. Because these invaders were invisible to the naked eye, the devastation felt like a haunting, a mystery where the cause was hidden and the consequence was absolute ruin. You can almost feel the desperation of those farmers, watching their survival vanish into thin air, knowing that while they looked for soldiers on the horizon, the real war was already being won by organisms smaller than a grain of sand. Imagine waking up tomorrow to find that everything you own, the ground beneath your boots, the harvest in your fields, and the very security of your family's future, has been claimed by a force you never saw coming. You aren't just facing a predator, you are facing an invisible takeover. For generations, human civilization has built its foundation on the assumption that land is stable, but what if the earth beneath your feet isn't empty, deep underground? Hidden from human eyes and radar alike, lies a sprawling, complex colony of organisms thriving in the dark. These aren't just neighbors, they are competitors for survival. Every inch of soil they claim is a centimeter taken from your livelihood. They operate in a subterranean world where the rules of surface life don't apply, creating an expansive network that could destabilize your property and your peace of mind at any moment. You might think you are alone on your land. But beneath the grass and the topsoil, a silent expansion is underway. This isn't just a biological curiosity, it is a hidden reality of territorial competition. When these colonies expand, they don't just occupy space, they consume resources, potentially compromising the integrity of your food source and the stability of your home. The threat isn't coming from across the border, it's rising from below. Imagine waking up to find your entire food supply systematically erased by an invisible, crawling army. You might think of them as simple pests, minor nuisances in the grass, but you would be dangerously mistaken. These insects weren't just a localized irritation, they were a calculated biological siege, a microscopic invasion that threatened the very foundation of human survival. When these swarms hit, they didn't just eat crops. They dismantled entire economies and crippled the ability of civilizations to feed themselves. The threat was so absolute, so invasive, that it forced a desperate pivot in global policy. Nations were pushed into a corner where management was no longer enough. To survive, governments had to undergo a radical transformation, rewriting centuries-old agricultural laws in a frantic race against extinction. They stopped viewing the insect kingdom as a part of nature and began declaring an all-out, official war on it. This wasn't just a policy change, it was a fundamental shift in how humanity perceives its place in the food chain. You are looking at the moment where human desperation met biological reality, forcing a permanent legal and chemical offensive against the smallest soldiers on Earth. Every law rewritten and every war declared serves as a chilling reminder. When the source of your sustenance is under siege, the rules of engagement change instantly. You might think the smallest creatures in nature hold the least power, but there is a terrifying truth about the scale of human deception that can make your skin crawl. If you believe that only insects are small and insignificant, prepare to have that perspective shattered by a history so cold it will chill your blood. We aren't talking about bugs, we are talking about the staggering magnitude of human betrayal during the 18th century War of the Whales. Imagine navigating a vast, unforgiving ocean where the line between survival and execution was thinner than a blade of grass. In this era, the hunt for whale oil wasn't just a commercial venture, it was a brutal theater of greed where trust was a luxury no one could afford to keep. When you look at the records of this conflict, you see a web of double crosses and clandestine maneuvers that would leave a modern observer breathless. The scale of the deception involved thousands of lives hanging in the balance, dictated by secret pacts and backroom deals. It wasn't just an industry, it was a shadow war where men traded their loyalty for a seat at the table. You have to wonder, in a world governed by such ruthless betrayal, how much of our modern history was built upon foundations of lies that we simply chose to forget. You think you're looking at the remains of a primitive blood sport, but what if I told you that every scar on these skeletons marks a calculated move in a desperate game of global survival? You might believe these giants were hunted for sport, the trophy of a primitive hunter's ego, but the truth is far more chilling and systematic. They weren't being targeted for glory. They were being harvested as a massive source of oil and bone during a period of devastating global resource famine. Imagine a world where the very ground beneath your feet was running dry, and the only remaining fuel for industry lay within these colossal frames. Every kill was an industrial extraction. To the desperate nations of that era, these creatures weren't symbols of majesty, they were walking warehouses of raw materials. The oil rendered from their blubber powered the engines of a starving economy, while their massive bones were stripped and processed to fortify infrastructure. They were processed like timber and mined like ore. When you look at these remains today, you aren't seeing the aftermath of a hunt. You are looking at the graveyard of a desperate era where humanity chose survival over preservation. The famine forced a choice: let the giants live in peace, or dismantle them to keep the world turning. They chose the latter. Imagine walking into a forest and realizing that every shadow, every rustle in the brush, and every silent footprint belongs to something that is already being erased from the map. You might think they are hiding, but the truth is far more chilling. They aren't hiding, they are disappearing. The hunt was so systematic it nearly drove the species to extinction before you even had a chance to see them in the wild. This wasn't a series of random encounters or accidental losses. It was a calculated, relentless campaign of removal. Every organized expedition and every recorded expedition targeted their very existence until their numbers plummeted towards zero. By the time the world finally turned its eyes toward these creatures, they were already teetering on the edge of permanent void. You are looking at the ghosts of a systematic eradication, a process so efficient that it nearly wiped them from the Earth's ledger before they could be documented in their natural habitat. They weren't just hunted, they were pursued with a clinical precision that left no room for survival. Every time you see one today, you aren't seeing a thriving population. You are witnessing a miracle of survival against an industrial-scale campaign to erase them forever. The gap between their presence and their total disappearance is the only reason they still exist to be witnessed by your eyes today. You can't fight what you can't see, and in some cases, the deadliest predators are those that have mastered the art of remaining invisible. Imagine a silent invasion, not of soldiers or beasts, but of a microscopic organism hiding in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of your environment. For centuries, this unseen enemy didn't just exist, it waited. It sat dormant in the soil, in the water, and within the structures we built to keep us safe. Lurking beneath the threshold of human perception. You might think you are safe behind walls of stone or glass, but history tells a different story. The most unsettling war isn't fought on a battlefield with clashing steel or roaring cannons. It is a biological siege that has been waged for hundreds of years without a single shot being fired. These organisms didn't need to be large to be lethal, they only needed to be persistent. They mastered the ultimate survival strategy, staying hidden. While humanity built civilizations and empires, these microscopic invaders were moving in the shadows, evolving alongside us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every time you think you understand the threats surrounding you, remember that the most dangerous enemies are often those that have spent centuries perfecting the art of being overlooked by your eyes. Imagine looking at your dinner table tonight and realizing that every single calorie sustaining your life could vanish in a single season. You wouldn't just be hungry, you would be facing an invisible, creeping extinction. In the 1800s, this wasn't a nightmare of fiction. It was a terrifying reality for millions across Northern Europe. They were trapped in a silent war against a microscopic invader that sought to dismantle the very foundation of their survival, the potato. For centuries, this humble tuber had become the backbone of life, the primary source of nutrients for a massive population. But when a devastating blight struck, it didn't just rot the crops, it dismantled the social fabric of entire nations. The threat was invisible but absolute, as the fields turned black and the vines withered. The silence of the rotting earth signaled an impending catastrophe. People weren't just facing a bad harvest, they were staring down a total collapse of food security. Every empty stomach in those villages was a ticking clock, a desperate race against starvation that threatened to wipe out entire generations. This wasn't just a botanical failure, it was a desperate struggle for existence against a biological foe that turned a staple crop into a death sentence, forcing a population to fight a war where the enemy was already inside their food supply. Imagine waking up in a frozen wasteland, your stomach cramping with an emptiness that feels like it will never end. You are starving because the very ground beneath your feet has turned against you. You wouldn't have survived a single winter without the intervention of scientists who discovered the truth behind the rotting crops. For centuries, people watched their harvests wither and turn to black sludge in the fields, dying in silence as they failed to understand why their lifeblood was decaying before it could reach their plates. They didn't know that a microscopic war was being waged beneath the soil, invisible to the naked eye, but devastating to human survival. These scientists didn't just find a solution, they unraveled a biological mystery that stood between civilization and total collapse. By identifying the specific pathogens and environmental triggers causing the rot, they unlocked the secret to preserving our food supply. Every loaf of bread you break today and every grain of wheat you consume carries the legacy of those who decoded the science of decay. They turned a death sentence into a triumph of agriculture, ensuring that the next frost wouldn't be your last. They saw the invisible rot where others saw only misfortune, creating a shield of knowledge that keeps your dinner table full while the world outside remains cold and unforgiving. You think you know what it takes to win, but you have no idea how close your own life is to a game played by rules you aren't allowed to see. You believe the victory was won through grit, strategy, or sheer willpower, but those are just the stories they let the public hear. The truth is far more unsettling. Because that's not even the strangest part of this entire conspiracy. The actual secret behind how they won involves a hidden history of chemical warfare that remained buried and banned for decades. Imagine a weapon so volatile, so devastating to the human biological system, that it was scrubbed from the official records and locked away in the shadows of history. It wasn't just a tactical choice, it was a forbidden shortcut. By utilizing substances that were officially outlawed by international accords, they bypassed the natural limits of human endurance. They didn't just beat their opponents, they chemically dismantled the very possibility of resistance. Now you have to ask yourself, if they were willing to use weapons that the world agreed were too dangerous to exist, what else are they willing to do behind closed doors? The fact remains, the victory wasn't a triumph of spirit, but a calculated exploitation of a forbidden science that history tried to erase. Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding that every grocery store shelf is empty. The very fuel that keeps your body running wiped out by a microscopic predator you cannot see, smell, or touch. It is a silent, creeping threat to our survival, an invisible invader capable of dismantling the global food supply in a matter of days. But history tells us that when humanity faced this existential crisis, they didn't just find a simple cure. They weaponized chemistry to fight back. This wasn't just a laboratory success, it was the creation of a chemical shield designed to incinerate and neutralize the threat at its source. They took the raw principles of molecular science and forged them into a defensive weapon, turning what was once a desperate search for survival into a calculated strike against the enemy. By mastering these complex chemical reactions, they didn't just protect the harvest. They engineered a failsafe to ensure that no invisible invader could ever erase our ability to feed ourselves. Every time you sit down to eat, you are seeing the result of that high-stakes battle, the triumph of chemistry over biological destruction. You aren't just looking at food, you are looking at a victory won by scientists who refused to let an invisible force dictate the terms of our survival. They locked the door against the void. And they did it using the very elements of the earth itself. Imagine a silent, invisible killer crawling across your skin, multiplying in the darkness while you sleep. a threat so pervasive it could turn a battlefield into a graveyard before a single bullet is fired. You might think the deadliest enemies of the early 20th century were the men in opposing trenches, but there was another war raging just beneath their uniforms. While soldiers faced the iron and lead of the Great War, they were simultaneously locked in a desperate, grueling struggle against an even more intimate foe. It was known as the War of the Lice. These microscopic invaders weren't just a nuisance, they were a biological siege, breeding in the seams of wool coats and the folds of heavy trousers. In the mud of the trenches, these parasites thrived, spreading rapidly through crowded ranks, draining the morale and health of thousands. For every soldier facing a sniper's bullet, there were hundreds more battling an infestation that turned their own clothing into a hostile territory. This wasn't just a footnote in history, it was a grueling, hidden conflict where hygiene became a matter of survival. To understand the true experience of the front lines, you have to look past the explosions and see the microscopic war being fought in the shadows, a secret struggle against an enemy that didn't wear a uniform but sought to conquer every man on the field. You are looking at a battlefield where the greatest threat wasn't the man holding the rifle across no man's land, but something invisible, microscopic, and far more patient. You might think trench warfare was won by soldiers with grit or generals with grand strategies, but history hides a darker truth. The outcome was dictated by a parasite that could kill more men than heavy artillery. Imagine standing in the mud of the Great War, where every breath is thick with decay. While shells tore through earth and bone, a silent predator was infiltrating the very bloodstreams of the infantry. This wasn't just an infection, it was a biological siege. For every soldier struck down by a bullet, dozens more were being systematically dismantled from the inside out by pathogens that thrived in the filth of the trenches. These organisms didn't care about borders or flags, they only cared about survival. They turned the front lines into a laboratory of agony, forcing armies to reconsider the very nature of human endurance. When medicine failed and the numbers of the fallen skyrocketed due to disease rather than combat, the true power dynamic shifted. The war wasn't just fought between nations, it was a desperate struggle against a microscopic invader that proved, in the ultimate test of survival, biology is often more lethal than steel. Imagine standing on a battlefield where the primary threat isn't the man aiming the rifle at you, but something so microscopic it's invisible to the naked eye, yet it has the power to paralyze an entire army. You wouldn't hear them coming, you wouldn't see them crawling, but millions of soldiers were incapacitated not by bullets, but by a tiny insect that infested their uniforms and uniforms alone. It was a silent, microscopic siege that turned high-powered military gear into a delivery system for total physical collapse. Picture the chaos. Thousands of men suddenly collapsing in the mud, their muscles seizing and their bodies locking up as if gripped by an invisible hand. The enemy wasn't using explosives to break their lines, they were exploiting a biological loophole. These insects found their way into the very fabric of the soldiers' clothing, colonizing the fibers until the mere act of wearing the uniform became a death sentence for mobility. It turned every stitch of cloth into a potential trap. You could look at your own clothes right now and wonder if you're safe, but in that moment, the uniform was no longer a symbol of protection. It was a vessel for a hidden, invasive force. The sheer scale of the infestation meant that an entire front line could be neutralized without a single shot being fired, leaving millions helpless against a microscopic invader. Imagine a battlefield where the greatest threat isn't a bullet or a blade, but an invisible, microscopic predator crawling through the trenches to claim your life. You wouldn't see it coming until your lungs seized and your body began to shut down from within. This wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a biological siege. The sheer scale of the devastation forced a desperate, radical pivot in human history, the first mass-scale chemical interventions in modern military history. For the first time, the lines between medicine and warfare blurred into a singular, desperate struggle for survival. Doctors were no longer just treating individual wounds. They were fighting a systemic, widespread contagion that threatened to wipe out entire battalions in days. This forced shift changed medicine forever, fundamentally altering how we treat infection, manage mass casualties, and deploy chemical countermeasures on a global scale. Every modern protocol used to stop a plague or neutralize a toxin today can trace its lineage back to those desperate moments of crisis. By forcing the hand of innovation under the pressure of total war, this siege shattered old medical boundaries and forged the foundation of modern pharmaceutical intervention. You are looking at the moment medicine stopped being a passive art and became an active, aggressive shield against invisible enemies, a transformation that still dictates how we fight for our lives today. You are walking through a world built on secrets, where the very ground beneath your feet hides the scars of a past they never taught you in school. Look closely at the gaps in your education and ask yourself, why did your history books skip over these specific conflicts? It isn't an accident of printing or a simple oversight by a tired teacher. It is a deliberate curation of the narrative. When certain battles, names, and dates are scrubbed from the record, the truth becomes diluted. leaving you with a sanitized version of reality that serves someone else's agenda. Imagine the power held by those who decide what stays in the chapter and what gets tossed into the furnace of forgotten history. Every omitted conflict represents a silenced voice, a suppressed struggle, or a truth too volatile to be printed on a standard classroom page. By removing these specific moments of upheaval, the architects of your education have smoothed over the jagged edges of the past, creating a polished surface that hides the deep fractures underneath. You are being fed a curated timeline designed to keep you looking forward, while the most explosive chapters remain locked behind a veil of silence. To find the truth, you have to look into those empty spaces, the holes in the book where the real history was hidden from your eyes. You are walking through a history book that has been scrubbed clean, and you have no idea what was erased to make it look this way. We want to believe in the myth of the Glorious Crusade, but there is a darker reason why certain chapters of human conflict were systematically buried under layers of silence. Some wars weren't just lost, they were deemed too undignified or scientifically complex for the public eye. Imagine a battlefield so grotesque, or a tactical maneuver so morally bankrupt that it threatened to shatter the polished narrative of human heroism. When the reality of the carnage became impossible to sell as a moral victory, those conflicts were pushed into the shadows. These weren't just accidents of history, they were deliberate deletions. By burying the complexities of these specific wars, architects of power ensured you would only see the heroic struggle, never the ugly, grinding machinery of what actually happened in the mud. They traded the uncomfortable truth for a comfortable lie, choosing to hide the scientific complications and the raw, unpolished chaos that would have made common people recoil. Every time you feel a gap in your knowledge about why certain eras seem so strangely silent, remember, it's because the truth was too jagged to fit into the story they wanted to tell you. Some secrets are buried not because they are forgotten, but because they are too dangerous to be seen. You've been told a lie that keeps you safe from the most terrifying truth of all. They want you to believe that war is merely a political chess match, a conscious choice made by leaders in suits, decided over maps and treaties. But if you look closer at the history written in blood, you realize that isn't just a misunderstanding, it's a deliberate distraction. The reality is far more primal. War isn't a diplomatic disagreement, it is a desperate, visceral struggle against the very environment surrounding you. It is the raw, frantic fight for resources, space, and survival against a world that is often indifferent to your existence. When the borders dissolve and the politics fade away, what remains is the terrifying reality of scarcity. They want you focused on the flags and the names of nations because it hides the truth, that every conflict is actually a desperate scramble against a landscape that demands everything from those who inhabit it. You aren't watching a debate over ideology, you are witnessing a primal fight for the right to exist in a world of finite resources. They've packaged the chaos into causes and policies, but underneath the surface, it is always the same desperate gamble against the elements. Look past the headlines, and you'll see that the only true battle is man versus the environment. Imagine for a moment that every memory you hold dear, the names of your ancestors, the hard-won lessons of your childhood, was suddenly erased, leaving you defenseless against the unknown. This is the silent tax of historical amnesia. When we dismiss certain conflicts as minor or insignificant, we aren't just tidying up a textbook, we are voluntarily deleting the blueprint of our own survival. Every minor skirmish and forgotten siege contains a coded truth about human endurance that you cannot afford to lose. If we refuse to acknowledge these smaller sparks of conflict, we strip away the very evidence of how we navigated the darkest corridors of history. These aren't just footnotes, they are the raw data of human resilience. When you ignore the small wars, you lose the granular details of how communities were built, how families endured, and how systems collapsed or held firm under pressure. We risk becoming a society with no map, wandering into the future without knowing which paths were paved in blood and which ones led to safety. By erasing these moments from our collective memory, we trade our wisdom for convenience. You aren't just forgetting a date, you are discarding the survival manual of the human race. To ignore these stories is to gamble with your own understanding of what it means to persist when everything else falls away. Imagine living in a city where the very air you breathe is being colonized by an invasive force, and your only defense is a desperate, escalating battle for survival. You might think of them as mere pests, but look closer at history and you'll see a much darker motive. Take the Pigeon War, it wasn't just about birds. It was a desperate attempt to control urban space in a crumbling empire. In these decaying cityscapes, every square inch of pavement and stone represented a foothold for power, and the pigeons were the unwanted occupants claiming that territory. When an empire begins to fracture, its grip on order loosens, allowing common spaces to fall into chaos. The authorities didn't just see feathers and beaks, they saw a symbol of uncontrollable growth in a dying infrastructure. They weren't fighting for aesthetics. They were fighting to reclaim the physical boundaries of their authority before the rot spread any further. Every trap set and every policy enacted was a frantic move in a high-stakes game of urban dominance. By framing the conflict as a war, the state attempted to mask its true goal, reclaiming control over a crumbling society. You have to ask yourself, when the walls begin to crack, who is really being targeted? The birds were just the visible symptom. The real war was fought over who would hold the keys to the city's remains. You are walking through a world that was forged in fire and blood, but you might not realize how close it came to ending before you were even born. Look closer at the ground beneath your feet and the very air you breathe. Every microscopic struggle is a silent war zone. Every one of these conflicts, the ants, the lice, the blight, was a battle for survival that shaped your current reality. You see a simple colony of ants. But what you are actually witnessing is a sophisticated military campaign for territory and resources. You see a microscopic parasite like lice, but you are looking at an ancient biological siege that has haunted human history for millennia. And when you see the blight, that devastating plague of rot, you are seeing a relentless ecological hunter trying to dismantle the very foundations of our food supply. These aren't just random occurrences, they are desperate. High-stakes battles in a billion-year-old game of survival. If any one of these tiny enemies had won their specific war, your world would look unrecognizable today. You exist in the narrow gap between victory and extinction. Every breath you take is permitted only because these smaller lives lost their fight to yours. The history of life isn't a peaceful progression. It is a brutal, constant siege where every organism is fighting to stay alive for one more day. Look closely at the ground beneath your feet and ask yourself, if a threat is invisible, how can you be certain it has already been defeated? You are moving through your day with a sense of security that feels like a given, but what if that safety is actually a ghost? A lingering echo of a war you were never told was being fought. You are currently living in the aftermath of victories over enemies you don't even know exist today. Every breath of peace, every moment of stability, and every basic luxury you take for granted is the spoils of a conflict hidden from your eyes. These aren't just abstract concepts. They are the physical remnants of battles fought in shadows where no one cheered and no one saw the blades. You walk through doors that were once barred by force. You breathe air that was once choked by decay. The danger isn't that the enemy is coming for you today, it's that the very fact of your survival suggests a massive, invisible struggle has already occurred in your name. You are walking through a graveyard of threats that were neutralized before they could reach your door. You are standing in the silence left behind by a roar you'll never hear. The question isn't whether you are safe, it's how many invisible wars had to be won just to give you this single, quiet moment. Look closely at the common sparrow on your windowsill or the small beetle crawling across your floor, and you might see something harmless, but history tells a much more violent story. You are walking among shadows of ancient power. Every time you glance at a bird or notice a pest in your home, you are looking at a biological weapon that in a different era possessed the raw power to topple empires and systematically end entire civilizations. These weren't just nuisances. They were unstoppable engines of destruction. One invasive species can collapse an entire agricultural system overnight, turning fertile lands into desolate wastes and starving millions. A single feathered traveler crossing a border could carry a plague that halts the gears of a kingdom, collapsing trade routes and toppling dynasties from within. These creatures didn't just survive, they conquered by outlasting human defenses. They are masters of adaptation, capable of infiltrating our food chains, our environments, and our very way of life. When you see them today, don't mistake their small size for weakness. You are looking at the descendants of organisms that survived the rise and fall of kings. They are the survivors of 1,000 wars fought in the dirt and the sky. Next time you see one, remember, it isn't just a pest, it is a remnant of an ancient force capable of bringing a world to its knees. You are walking through a world built on secrets, where the very ground beneath your feet is laid over truths that were intentionally buried before they could reach your ears. You might believe you know the timeline of our past, but what if I told you that history isn't just what we choose to remember? It is actually everything they tried to hide from you. Every chapter in your school books has been carefully curated, scrubbed of the uncomfortable, jagged edges that would shatter the comfortable illusions of today. There are echoes of conflict still vibrating in the soil, muffled by decades of convenient silence and deliberate omission. These aren't just footnotes. They are the suppressed screams of civilizations, erased from the headlines to keep you compliant with a simplified narrative. You have been fed a sanitized version of existence while the raw, visceral truth sits locked away in archives accessible only to the few. But those shadows are starting to flicker. The veil is thinning, and the ghosts of these silenced eras are beginning to demand recognition. If you want to see the world as it truly was, not as they told you it should be, you must look where they told you not to look. Hit subscribe right now to uncover more of the forgotten wars and reclaim the history that was stolen from your memory.